My son sold the house in Plano for $620,000 and let his wife spend every last cent. Then they showed up asking to stay at my place in DeSoto. I refused. That same day, my daughter-in-law slapped me right in the yard in front of all the neighbors. And that same day, I called my lawyer. And when they received the summons, but to understand why I, a 64-year-old mother, did what many people call cruel, I have to tell you from the beginning. Tell you about that October morning when everything I had ever believed about family, about sacrifice, and about the son I had poured my youth into raising, shattered right in front of my eyes. My name is Glenda Carver, and this is the story of how I had to learn to say no to my own child, to save us both. That morning, I was tending to the rose garden behind the house. The late-blooming roses at the end of autumn were still trying to open their petals, even though the Texas weather had started to turn cold. I liked mornings like that. Quiet, nothing but birdsong, and the smell of damp soil after last night's rain. The DeSoto neighborhood where I live is a fairly peaceful residential area. 2-story houses close together, neighbors who still recognize each other and know each other's names. I've lived here for 15 years since my husband, David, was still alive. David died 5 years ago from a heart attack that came far too suddenly. He was an electrician, a simple man, someone who worked hard his entire life just to take care of our small family. After he died, this house became everything I had left. Not big, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a small cozy kitchen, but it was mine. 30 years of mortgage payments, dollar by dollar to have this place. Now, at 64, I'm retired from my full-time accounting job. I only work a few hours a week at a small office in Cedar Hill to bring in a little extra income. My life is simple. I don't need much. Just this small garden, quiet mornings, and the occasional sound of my son's voice on the phone. Terrell. My only son. I remember clearly when he was little. Terrell used to run out into the garden with me, tiny hands gripping a toy shovel, asking what this flower was called, how that one should be planted. And after David died, I still remember vividly the 13-year-old boy who looked straight at me and said, "Mom, don't worry. I'll protect you forever." I believed that promise. I sacrificed everything for him. I worked 2, 3 jobs just to have enough money for his education. I gave up my plan to go back to community college for a higher degree because Terrell's tuition mattered more. I didn't travel. I didn't buy expensive clothes. Even the car I'm driving now is still the 2008 Honda Accord David left behind. All of it, just because I wanted my child to have a better future. And Terrell didn't disappoint me, at least not at first. He graduated from college, got a stable job in finance, bought a beautiful house in Plano. I was so proud, I thought I had done the right thing. Until he met Raina. The sound of an engine snapped me out of my thoughts. I recognized it immediately, Terrell's SUV. But something felt different from usual. The car doors slammed, hurried, frantic, like they were running from something. I took off my gardening gloves, wiped my hands on my apron, and walked around to the front, and I saw my son standing on the steps, and beside him was Raina, his wife. But they didn't bring gifts or smiles like they usually did on normal visits. Raina stood next to 2 large suitcases. Terrell was pulling more bags out of the trunk. My heart started pounding faster. Something was wrong. "Terrell?" I called, trying to keep my voice calm. "What's going on?" Terrell turned around. His eyes looked different. Dark circles were clear under them. His shirt collar hung crooked on one side. His hair was messy. Terrell was always neat, always put together. But today he looked like someone who hadn't slept for nights in a row. Raina was the complete opposite. She stood there in designer clothes. I was sure they were new because I'd never seen them before. Her blonde hair perfectly styled into glossy waves, her nails painted a bright red. And most importantly, her eyes swept over my house like she was taking inventory, like every item in my living room was a number she was calculating in her head. I didn't like that feeling. "Mom." Terrell said, his voice tight. "I need to talk to you." I opened the door and let them in. Their footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor, flooring David had installed with his own hands 20 years ago. Terrell dropped into the old armchair, the same chair David used to sit in every night to read the newspaper before he died. Raina stood beside him, hands on her hips, her expression unreadable. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the pot I'd made that morning. My hands didn't shake, but inside I knew this wasn't going to be good. "I'm listening," I said, sitting down in the chair across from them. Terrell glanced at Raina, and Raina nodded. Just a tiny nod, but it felt like an order. "Mom," Terrell began, "I sold the house in Plano." I set my coffee cup down. The soft clink of porcelain against porcelain was quiet, but in my ears it sounded like a heavy period. "Which house?" I asked, even though deep down I already knew the answer. "My house, the one off Legacy Drive." That house, that beautiful colonial-style home, where I had contributed $40,000 from my retirement savings as the down payment. The house where I'd spent countless weekends painting walls until late at night, planting trees in the yard, trees Raina never once bothered to water. I still remembered my back aching after bending down to pack soil around the roots for them. "You unsold it?" My voice came out smaller than I wanted. "Why didn't you tell me you were planning to sell?" Raina spoke up, for the first time since stepping inside. "It's our house, Glenda. We don't need permission." Her voice was cold, like she was stating something obvious. But beneath that tone, I heard something else, something that made my skin prickle. I took a breath, trying to stay calm. "I understand it's your house, but we talked about long-term plans. You said that house was perfect to settle down, to raise children, to build a future." Terrell shifted, avoiding my eyes. "Plans changed, Mom." "Changed how?" I asked. "How much did you sell it for?" Raina answered immediately, before Terrell could even open his mouth. $620,000. Something in her voice, almost delighted, like she was showing off a victory. My breath caught. $620,000. That number was bigger than the total amount I had earned in 10 years of work before retirement. "Oh my God," I exhaled. "That's incredible. So where are you moving? Did you find a bigger house? A better school district for the future?" Silence. A thick, heavy silence. Terrell stared down at his hands. Raina examined her bright red nails like none of this concerned her. Finally, Terrell spoke, very slowly. "Actually, Mom, we were hoping we could stay with you for a while." I blinked as if I'd misheard. "Stay here?" "Just temporarily, Mom," Terrell said quickly. "Maybe a few months. I won't bother you." I looked straight at him. "But where's the money from the sale, Terrell? Where did $620,000 go?" Silence again, this time even heavier. "More dangerous." Raina smoothed her dress, her voice casual, as if talking about the weather. "I had some expenses to handle. Necessary things." "What expenses?" I asked. "Personal things," she said shortly, like that settled it. But I wasn't letting it go. "Raina, you just sold a house for over $600,000. What expenses could—" "I bought jewelry," she cut in, "and clothes. I upgraded the interior of the car. I also took a spa trip to Palm Springs with my sister. Oh, and I paid off my credit card debt." I stared at her, waiting for an explanation. But Raina stayed silent, as if that list was enough to end the conversation, and I felt something cold begin to spread through my chest. "How much jewelry?" I asked, my voice so soft I surprised myself. "Why does it matter?" Raina snapped back. "It's my money to spend." "Your money?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. Terrell finally looked up at me, his eyes full of pleading. "Mom, please, we just need somewhere to stay while we figure things out." "Figure things out?" I repeated. "Terrell, you just had over $500,000. Why can't you stand on your own?" "It's complicated," he muttered. I looked back and forth between my son and my daughter-in-law, and maybe for the first time, I really saw them. Terrell, the son I raised to be responsible, to think before acting, was sitting in his mother's living room, homeless, even though he'd just had a sum of money most people never see in their entire lives. And Raina, the woman who hadn't worked a single day since marrying my son, sat there in an outfit that looked more expensive than my monthly Social Security check. I took a long breath. "Raina, where's the rest of the money?" She rolled her eyes. "I told you I had expenses." "Worth $620,000? Not your business," Raina said, her voice dry. And right then, something in me snapped. It becomes my business when you show up here asking for a place to live after spending it all. Terrell buried his head in his hands. "Mom, please don't make this harder." "Harder?" I shot up from my seat, the coffee cup forgotten on the table. "Terrell, explain it to me. You had a beautiful house, money in the bank. Now you're here asking to stay with me, your 64-year-old retired mother, because your wife spent it on jewelry and a spa trip?" "Not just jewelry and a spa trip," Raina said defensively. "I had debts." "What debts?" I asked. "Credit card debt." "How much?" She glared. "Enough." I turned to Terrell. "Terrell, tell me." My son lifted his head. And in his eyes, I saw something that made my heart feel like it was breaking apart. Failure, shame, and surrender, as if he'd given up a long time ago. "How much, Terrell?" I asked again. He let out a deep sigh. "About $80,000. I felt dizzy. $80,000 in credit card debt? My voice cracked. What did my daughter-in-law buy to get to $80,000? Mostly clothes, Terrell said quietly. Shoes, handbags, vacations, before we got married. Before they got married, meaning Terrell only found out about this debt after he'd already married Raina. I stared straight at Raina. And the rest of the money from the sale? Terrell glanced at his wife again. Raina's eyes stayed glued to her phone like this was someone else's problem. She wanted to redecorate her sister's house as a surprise gift, Terrell said, his voice hoarse. Then she bought a new car for her mother, and she wanted to invest in her friend's business. What business? I asked. A boutique, Raina replied, still not looking up. It's going to be very successful. How much money? I asked, even though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. $300,000. That number hit me like a blow to the chest. $300,000 invested in a friend's boutique by a woman who had never run a business, never held a job, never cared about anything beyond shopping and spa trips. I sank back into the chair, feeling like all 64 years of my life had collapsed onto my shoulders. Let me make sure I understand, I said, almost in a whisper. You sold the house for $620,000. $80,000 went to pay off Raina's credit card debt. $300,000 went to Raina's friend's boutique. So where's the rest? I already told you, Raina replied, finally looking up, irritation clear on her face. I had expenses. Jewelry, the spa trip, the car upgrades, supplies for the shop, gifts for my family. It adds up. I did the math quickly in my head. No matter how generously I interpreted that list, there should still be at least $50,000 left, maybe more. So where's the remaining money? I asked. There isn't any, Raina said flatly. It's all gone. All gone. More than $600,000 vanished in a few months. Jewelry, spa trips, credit card debt, and an investment boutique that I would bet would never turn a profit. I leaned back, feeling like the whole world was spinning, and I realized this wasn't just about money. This was about the son I had raised, the values I had tried to teach, and the woman who had convinced him to throw it all away. So now, you want to live here, I said. Not a question, but a statement. Just temporarily, Terrell repeated, his voice almost begging. I looked around my small house, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a cramped kitchen. I'd worked 30 years to pay off the loan, to have a place that belonged to me, somewhere I could live out my retirement in peace. What's your plan? I asked. How are you going to get back on your feet? Terrell and Raina exchanged a look. Terrell will keep working, of course, Raina said, and I'm sure the boutique will start making profit soon. And if it doesn't? I asked. She shrugged. Then we'll think of something else. I stared at this woman who had convinced my son to sell his house and blow through over $500,000 in a few months, now sitting in my living room with the calm confidence of someone waiting to be supported. No, I said, softly but clearly. What? Terrell looked up, shocked. I said, no, you can't stay here. The air in the room seemed to turn cold. The word no hung between us like a challenge. I saw Terrell's face fall, but Raina's reaction unsettled me the most. Her perfect mask slipped for a split second, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. You can't say that, Terrell said, his voice rising. We're family. Yes, I replied, trying to stay calm. We are family, and because we are family, that's exactly why I can't enable the disaster you've created. Raina set her phone down on the coffee table with a deliberate motion, hard enough that I heard a dry, sharp thud. Enable what? She snapped. Disaster? My husband made a business decision. Not every investment pays off immediately. A business decision? I couldn't hide the doubt in my voice. Raina, spending $600,000 on jewelry, spa trips, and your friend's boutique is not a business decision. That's reckless spending. How dare you judge how I spend my money? She yelled. That wasn't your money, I said, quiet but firm. And I knew. From that moment on, everything would only get worse. If you've made it this far, comment the city you're watching from so I know who this story has reached. And make sure you follow for the next part. Because only a few hours after that, Raina did something right in my front yard that left the entire neighborhood frozen in shock. Terrell sprang to his feet and strode quickly to the front window. His hand gripped the window frame as if he were trying to keep his own balance. His voice turned hoarse. Mom, if there's nowhere else, we truly don't know where to go. I drew in a deep breath, forcing my voice not to crack, even though everything inside me was boiling. And what about Raina's family? I asked. Surely her parents... Terrell turned back, his face rigid. Her parents live in a one-bedroom apartment, he said quickly, as if he'd prepared the answer in advance. And Raina's sister doesn't have space. Her sister. The one Raina had just casually said she'd spent a pile of money to redecorate as a surprise gift. Raina's eyes flashed, sharp as blades. My personal relationships are none of your business. I stood up. The last of my calm splintered into cracks. It became Mom's business the moment the two of you stood at my door asking for help. I looked straight at Raina. You spent my son's future on meaningless things. And now you want me to clean up that mess? Not meaningless, Raina screamed, springing up like a coiled wire. You wouldn't understand. You've lived in this little house your whole life, wearing those shabby old clothes, driving that old car. You don't know what it's like to live with class. That insult hit its mark, but I didn't let it show on my face. I only felt something inside me turn cold, while something else started to burn hotter. No, Raina, I said slowly. Mom doesn't know that kind of life, spending other people's money on luxury, then coming back demanding they house you when the money runs out. Terrell stepped away from the window and faced me. His cheeks were flushed, his voice squeezed between two cliffs. Mom, please, I know Raina made some mistakes. Some mistakes? I cut in, unable to stomach how lightly he said it. Terrell, your wife spent over $620,000 in a few months. This isn't some mistakes. This is a pattern. You don't know anything about our marriage, Raina hissed through clenched teeth. I answered immediately, without thinking. Mom knows what it means to live within your means. Mom knows if you want something, you save for it. You work for it. You don't expect someone else to carry it for you. Raina's face twisted with fury. Oh, so you're perfect then, Glenda. the perfect mother who raised the perfect son, and then that son married the wrong woman. I'm not saying that, I replied, my voice still even, though my chest felt heavy as stone. You don't have to say it, Raina snapped. It's written all over your face every time you look at me. And the truth is, part of what she said was right. I had never liked Raina from the moment Terrell brought her home for the first time 3 years ago. But it wasn't because of her background or her looks. It was because of moments like this, when the mask slipped, revealing someone calculating, manipulative, and irresponsible underneath. I lowered my voice, trying to speak like an adult who was doing everything in her power to keep this from exploding. Raina, Mom doesn't hate you for who you are. Mom hates the choices you make and how they're destroying my son. My husband is a grown man, she shot back, eyes full of challenge. He makes his own choices. Is that so? I turned to Terrell, locking eyes with him. Whose idea was it to sell the house? Terrell hesitated. Just 1 second, but I saw it clearly. It was something we discussed together, he said. I nodded slowly. Whose idea was it to invest $300,000 into a boutique? Terrell hesitated again, this time longer. Raina thought it was a good opportunity. I didn't let it go. Whose idea was it to pay off $80,000 in credit card debt you didn't even know existed until after you were married? Whose idea was that? Terrell's face burned red. He swallowed. Mom, please, answer the question, Terrell, I said, not loud but firm. In your marriage, who makes the financial decisions? We decide together, he said weakly, like he was reciting a line he'd memorized. Raina laughed, a dry, hollow sound that echoed through my living room. Oh, come on, Terrell. Tell your mother the truth. Tell her how you begged me to marry you. Tell her how grateful you are that someone like me even looked twice at someone like you. I felt the blood in my body turn to ice. I looked at Raina, then at Terrell. Someone like you? I repeated, my voice low. Yes, Raina said, venom dripping from every word. Beautiful, refined. Someone who could have any man she wanted. My husband knows he hit the jackpot when he married me. I turned to Terrell and waited for him to push back, waited for my son to stand up just once, for himself. But Terrell only stared at the floor. His shoulders slumped like a man who'd been stepped on for so long he'd forgotten what resistance even felt like. And now, Raina went on, getting bolder with every word, when we need help, my mother-in-law turns her back on us. What kind of mother does that? I heard my own voice tremble, even as I tried to keep it steady. The kind of mother who won't stand by and watch her son be destroyed by a manipulative woman. There was a very brief moment, I remember it so clearly I can still hear the clock ticking in the living room, when I thought, maybe I should soften a little. Let them stay a few days, and then figure it out. But then I looked into Terrell's eyes, not the eyes of a man going through a temporary setback, the eyes of someone who had gotten used to being controlled, so used to it that even being humiliated in front of his own mother, he still only knew how to bow his head. And in that instant, I understood. If I opened my door today, tomorrow I would no longer be the owner of this house. I would become someone who had to ask permission just to have peace in my own life. Raina curled her lip. Don't pretend you're kind, Glenda. You're just bitter. I hadn't even had time to answer when Raina screamed, as if she could tear my house down with sheer volume. You bitter old woman. You're jealous because your son chose me over you. You can't stand that he loves me more than he loves his pathetic, lonely mother. Raina, stop, Terrell said. But his voice was weak, like a reminder thrown out just to say he tried. No, I won't stop, Raina said, taking a step closer, her eyes blazing. She needs to hear it. You're a miserable old woman living in a falling-apart house, jealous of anyone who has more than you. You know what, Glenda? Your son doesn't need you anymore. He has me. Something shattered in my chest. All those years of biting my tongue, trying to be diplomatic, trying to endure for my son, collapsed like a rotten wall. "Get out of my house," I said, quiet but solid. "What?" "I said, get out of my house." Raina laughed, full of contempt. "You can't kick us out. We have nowhere to go." "That's not my problem," I replied. Terrell turned to me, his voice nearly pleading. "Mom, please reconsider. We really don't have anywhere else." "You should have thought about that before you let your wife spend your entire future on jewelry and spa trips," I said, each word dropping like stone. Raina moved in close, her face warped with rage. "You don't get to talk to me like that in front of my husband if I—" "This is my house," I said hard. "I'll speak the way I want, and right now I want you to leave." "We're not going anywhere." Raina folded her arms across her chest, defiant. I looked at Terrell, my child, the boy I once taught to stand up for what was right, to protect the people he loved. But in front of me now was a broken man trampled for so long he'd started to accept it as normal. "Terrell," I lowered my voice, making one last attempt to grab hold of a thread. "Tell your wife to leave my house." Terrell looked back and forth between us, his eyes reddening, his face crumpling like he was about to cry. "Mom, please let us stay a few days while we figure things—" "No." And that was when Raina lost whatever small scrap of composure she had left. "Fine," she screamed. "If you want to be selfish and heartless like that, then we'll make sure everyone knows what Glenda Carver really is." She lunged for the front door and yanked it so hard the door slammed into the wall. Outside, my neighbors, Mrs. Odessa King across the street and the Hensley family next door, were out in their yards. They looked up at the noise. "You want to know what Glenda Carver is really like?" Raina shrieked, her voice ringing through the quiet street. "She's throwing her own son out onto the street, her own son!" My cheeks burned with humiliation. I stood in the doorway, feeling like the entire neighborhood had spotlights aimed at my face. "Raina, please," Terrell said, this time a little firmer, like he was trying to pull her back. But it was too late. "No!" Raina screamed. "Let them know! This woman raised a son who worked his whole life to buy a beautiful house. And when life gets a little hard, when we need help, she slams the door in our faces." Mrs. Odessa King stepped closer, clearly trying to catch every word. "We're only asking for a temporary place to stay," Raina went on. And just as I'd expected, the tears started to fall. Tears that arrived at the perfect moment, in perfect rhythm. Just somewhere to live while we get back on our feet. And this heartless woman, refuses her own child. The quiet street, where I'd lived for 15 years, where my neighbors used to greet me with respect, had now become a stage for this performance. "That's enough," I said, stepping onto the porch. "No, it's not enough," Raina snapped around to face me. "Why? Because you're embarrassed? Good, you should be embarrassed, throwing your family out like trash." And then she did the thing that changed everything. In front of my neighbors, in front of God and everyone, Raina Carver raised her hand and slapped me square across the face. The sound echoed down the quiet street like a gunshot. I stumbled back, lifting a hand to my cheek, not because it hurt that much, but because I was shocked. For a moment, no one moved. Even Raina froze, as if she'd just realized what she'd done. Mrs. Odessa King sucked in a sharp breath. The Hensley's teenage son, who'd been mowing the lawn, shut off the mower and stared. I turned to Terrell. I waited for my son to react, waited for him to protect his mother, waited for at least one sentence. "Are you crazy?" But Terrell just stood there, confused, overwhelmed, like he'd witnessed an accident and didn't understand that he was part of it. "My daughter-in-law just hit me," I said very softly, my voice strangely calm even as rage boiled in my chest like water. Raina lifted her chin, defiant. "You deserved it. Throwing your family out like strangers." I looked around. Everyone had witnessed this humiliation. Mrs. Odessa King looked horrified. The Hensleys whispered to each other. Even the mail carrier stopped the truck. "Terrell," I said, almost a whisper, "your wife just assaulted me in front of the whole neighborhood." Terrell opened his mouth like he was going to say something, then closed it again. And you're going to stand there and let your wife do that? Mom, she's angry. She didn't mean it. She didn't mean to slap me in the face? I looked at the person in front of me, the child I had sacrificed my whole life for, and he couldn't even condemn his wife for hitting his mother. Raina shoved herself right between us. Don't try to make this about you being the victim, Glenda. You brought it on yourself. I stared at the woman who had just humiliated me in front of my neighbors, spent my son's financial future, and was now trying to paint me as the villain. Get off my property, I said, my voice low but ice cold. Right now. Go ahead. Kick us out, Raina sneered. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed 911. As the phone rang, I saw Raina's face shift from defiance to fear. Hello, I need the police to come to my address in DeSoto, I said into the phone, my voice so calm that even I was surprised. I need assistance to have the people trespassing removed from my property. They've just been violent. I hung up. Raina was staring at me, but it wasn't that smug, defiant look from a moment ago. For the first time since the day I met her, I saw something real in her eyes. Fear. You really called the police on your own son? She shouted, her voice shaking. No, I replied evenly, each word dropping like stone. Mom called the police on the woman who just assaulted her in front of witnesses. Raina stood frozen. Then she swallowed hard. All her confidence seemed to drain from her face in a single breath. The police arrived within 10 minutes, but to me, that stretch of time felt like an entire lifetime. The first to step out was Officer Kiana Mercer, a young female officer, probably in her early 30s. She had kind eyes and a professional stance that made me feel reassured at first glance. With her was Officer Vaughn Wallace, older, close to my age, gray at the temples with the tired gaze of someone who had witnessed too many family tragedies. While we waited for them to arrive, Raina had managed to steady herself somewhat. She wiped her tears, smoothed her hair, adjusted her posture, as if standing up straight could erase what she'd just done. But I could still see it. The panic was still buried deep in her eyes. As for Terrell, he stood beside the suitcases like a lost child. His hand hovered near the luggage handle, not knowing what to hold on to keep from shaking. Officer Mercer approached me first. Ma'am, we received a call about an assault. Yes, I said, pointing straight to my cheek, where it was still burning. This woman just slapped me. Officer Wallace turned to Raina, his tone stern. Is that true, ma'am? Raina immediately grabbed at an excuse the way a drowning person grabs a life preserver. She's unreasonable, she said, as if she's unreasonable could turn violence into something normal. We just needed a temporary place to stay. She threw us out like strangers. No matter what, it doesn't give you the right to assault anyone, Officer Mercer replied, firm. Then she turned back to me. Ma'am, do you want to press charges? I looked at Terrell. He lowered his head. Silent. Not a single word to defend his mother. Not one sentence to condemn what his wife had just done. The son I had raised with my youth. The child I had loved unconditionally. And in this moment, he didn't even dare stand on the side of what was right. I looked back at Officer Mercer. Yes, I said softly but firmly. I want to press charges. Raina's face went pale. You can't really say that. Officer Wallace didn't waver. Assault is serious, ma'am, he said. We have multiple witnesses who saw you slap Mrs. Mitchell. That's right. My neighbors were still out in their yards, watching every development. When Officer Mercer glanced over, Mrs. Odessa King nodded hard, like stamping the truth in place. I saw the whole thing, Mrs. King spoke up. She hit Glenda right in front of me, and no one provoked her at all. Raina whipped around, her voice sharp. This is ridiculous. She's my mother-in-law. This is just a family argument. Whether you're family or not, Officer Mercer said, her voice cold and clear, assault is still assault. You need to come with us. As they led Raina toward the patrol car, she looked back at Terrell like she was hooking him with her eyes. Don't just stand there, do something. But Terrell was like he'd been frozen in place. He only stood there watching his wife being led away on his mother's front lawn. Officer Wallace stepped over, holding a stack of paper. Mrs. Carver, we need you to come down to the DeSoto police station to make an official statement. Can you come this afternoon? Of course, I answered. The police car carrying Raina drove away, and as soon as the engine sound faded, Terrell began loading the luggage back into the SUV. He moved slowly, like someone walking through fog. Where will you go? I asked, even though the question sounded like a sigh. Terrell shrugged. I don't know. Maybe a hotel tonight. With what money? The question hung between us like a blade already raised. We both knew Terrell couldn't afford a hotel indefinitely. And we both knew this was only the beginning. Terrell, I lowered my voice, trying to speak like a mother who still wanted to save her child. This doesn't have to end like this. If you leave her, if you admit this whole situation is wrong, we can fix it. Terrell looked at me, his eyes tired like someone drained by too many things. Mom, she's my wife. I can't abandon her. She abandoned you the moment she spent your entire future on jewelry and spa trips. It's not that simple, I shook my head. Yes, it is, Terrell. It's exactly that simple. Terrell climbed into the SUV without another word. Then he drove away, leaving me standing on the porch, feeling a loneliness colder than the days after David died. The rest of that day passed like a fog. I went to the DeSoto police station and gave a statement, not only about the slap, but about the entire confrontation that led to it. The officer who took my statement was Detective Simone Red, a calm, attentive, professional woman. She didn't rush. She didn't judge. She just listened. As we neared the end, Detective Red set down her pen and looked at me directly. Mrs. Carver, I have to ask, is this the first time your daughter-in-law has behaved aggressively toward you? I considered it, then answered honestly. Physically, yes, but emotionally, she's been manipulating for years. Can you be more specific? So I told her. I told her about the slow isolation, how Raina always scheduled visits, at times she knew I couldn't make it, how she convinced Terrell to skip family gatherings and holidays, how she gradually turned Terrell against me, making him believe his mother was too critical, too intrusive. And the financial situation? Detective Red asked next. You said they sold their house and spent all the money. Over $600,000. Yes, I said, gone in a few months. Detective Red let out a soft whistle. That's a lot of money to burn through in a short time. She has expensive tastes, I said, my voice weary, and no concept of living within her means. And your son allowed that to happen? I sighed, as if I were exhaling an entire era. My son has been completely manipulated. He can't see what she's doing to him, to his future, and to our family. That night, back home alone, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of hot tea. The kitchen was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming and the wind brushing the window. And for the first time all day, I wasn't being dragged around by anger or shame. I just sat there and thought, clearly. Pressing charges against Raina was only the first step. She would come back. Terrell would come back too. And next time they might not scream in the yard or slap me in front of the neighbors. Next time they would be more subtle, softer, smoother. But it was that smoothness that frightened me most. I thought about the house in Plano, the house I had helped them buy. $40,000 from my retirement savings. Money I'd worked for decades to build. And now, essentially, it had been flushed away along with their equity. And then I suddenly remembered something. The day they bought the house, there was so much paperwork I felt like my entire life had been stamped onto it. And because I had contributed a significant portion to the down payment, the real estate attorney had insisted on putting a few protections in place. I stood up and went straight to my filing cabinet. I pulled out a folder labeled Terrell's House Purchase. Inside were copies of all the documents from the original transaction, and there, Tucked neatly between the pages was something I had almost forgotten, a promissory note. I remembered that day clearly when the attorney told me, "Mrs. Carver, I strongly recommend this be structured as a loan rather than a gift. It protects your interests and ensures your son understands the seriousness of receiving a large sum of money like that." Back then, I objected. I didn't want to turn a mother's love into a contract. I just wanted to help my child. But Terrell himself had insisted, "Mom, I want to pay you back. It should be official." The promissory note stated very clearly, $40,000 would be repaid with 5% interest, with payments beginning 1 year after the purchase date, and the loan was secured by the property itself, meaning I had a legal interest in that house. But Terrell and Raina had sold the house without repaying me. They hadn't even mentioned the loan still existed. I picked up my phone and called Dexter Hargrove, the attorney who had handled the original purchase transaction. His secretary said he could see me the next morning. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Terrell as a little boy, how he used to climb into my bed whenever there was a storm, how proud he was when he graduated college, how he cried at his father's funeral and promised he'd take care of me. Where did that boy go? And how did he become the man who stood silent while his wife assaulted his mother? The next morning, I dressed carefully in my best suit and drove to Dexter Hargrove's office in downtown Dallas. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, silver-haired, with a deep voice and a presence that naturally made people take things seriously. "Mrs. Carver," he said, shaking my hand warmly, "I'm very sorry to hear about your troubles. Please have a seat and tell me what happened." I told him everything, the sale of the house, the money being spent, the assault, the arrest. Dexter listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me for a moment, as if weighing every possibility. "Glenda," he said, "do you realize you have significant legal remedies here?" "What do you mean?" "The promissory note securing your $40,000 loan was recorded as a lien against the property," he explained. "When your son sold the house without satisfying that debt, he breached the terms of the note. You have grounds to sue for breach of contract and conversion." I felt something stir in my chest. Not quite hope, but something stronger than resignation. "So what does that mean, in practical terms?" "It means you can sue for the full amount of the loan plus interest plus damages," Dexter said. "And because the debt was secured by real property, you can attach other assets to satisfy a judgment." "What other assets?" I asked, my heart beating faster. Dexter gave a grim smile. "Let's see what your son and daughter-in-law have left after their spending spree." For nearly an hour after that, he explained my options. I could file a civil lawsuit to recover the loan, plus interest and damages. I could also pursue a criminal angle for theft by conversion, because they had sold an asset in which I held a legal interest without my consent. I clasped my hands together, my voice tightening. "But Dexter, I don't want to destroy my son's life. I just want him to understand. Actions have consequences." Dexter looked at me, his tone slow and steady. "Sometimes, Glenda, the kindest thing you can do for someone you love is to stop protecting them from the consequences of their choices." On the drive home, that sentence kept repeating in my head. Had I protected Terrell by staying silent through Raina's manipulation? Had I enabled bad decisions by always being ready to catch him every time he fell? When I got home, I made my decision. I called Dexter Hargrove and told him to file the lawsuit, not only against Raina, but against both of them. They were married. They had made the decision to sell the house together. Then they would face the consequences together. Then I did one more thing. I called a locksmith and changed every lock. I installed a security camera system, enough to record anyone who came near my property. I wasn't going to be caught off guard ever again. That afternoon, Terrell called. "Mom, Raina made bail. We need to talk." I stared at the screen for a few seconds before answering. My voice was calm to the point of cold. "There's no need, sweetheart. Mom, please. Terrell inhaled like he was trying not to collapse. She's sorry about hitting you. She was just too angry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't mock him. I simply said the truth, in the voice of someone who had run out of every kind of softness. Terrell, your wife stole $40,000 from me and then assaulted me when I refused to let you stay here, after you two wasted over $500,000. There's nothing left to discuss. The line went still. You mean, stole $40,000? I explained it clearly. The promissory note, the lien on the house, Dexter Hargrove confirming my legal interest, and the lawsuit I would file tomorrow morning. I spoke as plainly as if I were reading a bank statement, because if I softened, I would get pulled back into the old loop, forgiving, carrying the load, and enduring. The silence stretched so long I thought Terrell had hung up. Mom, he finally said, his voice trembling like wind slipping through a crack in the door. You can't sue us, we're family. I closed my eyes for a beat. That word, family, used to be all it took to melt me, but now it only hurt. Yes, Terrell. We're family. I spoke slowly, each word dragged out of my chest. And because of that, what you did to me is so much worse than a stranger stealing from me. We didn't steal from you. You sold a house with a $40,000 lien and didn't pay me back. I asked bluntly. What do you call that? Silence. The silence of someone who knows he's wrong but is still clinging to another label, so it won't feel as humiliating. Then Terrell asked, his voice smaller, Mom, how much are you suing for? $40,000 plus 3 years of interest, plus attorney's fees, plus damages for conversion and breach of contract, I said, like I was keeping a ledger. The lawyer estimates the total will be around $67,000. I heard Terrell suck in a sharp breath, like he'd been punched in the chest. We don't have $67,000. You should have thought about that before you let your wife spend your entire future on jewelry and spa trips. Mom, please, Terrell's voice broke. Can't we solve this another way? Maybe we pay it back over time? I gave a very soft laugh. Not the happy kind, but the kind of laugh that comes when you realize you've lived in an illusion for too long. You mean, like the original promissory note already stated? I asked. The one you ignored for 3 years, then sold the house as if it never existed? I heard Terrell breathe heavily. I paused for a moment, then my voice softened. Just a little, because no matter what, he was still my son. Where are you staying? A motel, Terrell answered. The cheapest one we could find in Oak Cliff. How long can you stay there? Maybe a week? 2 weeks if we're careful. And then what? Terrell choked up. I don't know, Mom. I really don't know. For a moment, I almost gave in. I could hear fear in his voice, the same fear that used to show up only when he had a high fever or woke from a nightmare. But then, the image of Raina's hand slamming into my face flashed so clearly, my cheek felt hot again. And something in me stood up straight. Terrell, I said slowly, firmly, I love you. I've always loved you. But I will not be manipulated, stolen from, or assaulted. I paused, letting the words land where they needed to land. If you want a relationship with me, you have to take responsibility for your choices and the consequences that come with them. What does that mean? It means you have to decide what matters more, your relationship with your wife or your relationship with your mother. My heart tightened, but my voice didn't shake. Because right now, you can't have both. I hung up before he could react. When I set my phone down, my hands were still trembling. Outside, the sun was setting over my quiet neighborhood. Mrs. Odessa King watering her flowers, the Hensley boy riding his bike in circles. Everything looked normal in a way that felt cruel, like life was deliberately pretending my home was still safe and whole. But I knew nothing could ever be normal again. Tomorrow, Terrell and Raina would receive legal papers, and I would find out, once again, whether the son I raised still existed somewhere inside the man Raina had molded him into. 3 days after I filed the lawsuit, Dexter Hargrove called me. The very first line sent a chill through my blood. "Glenda, I need you to sit down." I was already sitting at the kitchen table, but I still tightened my grip on the phone. "What is it?" "My investigator ran a background check on your daughter-in-law," Dexter said slowly, like he was about to say something that could break a family. "And we found some things. You need to know." My stomach dropped. "What kind of things?" "Raina has a behavioral pattern." Dexter exhaled lightly. "Before marrying your son, she was engaged to 2 other men. Both engagements ended when they found out she'd been using their credit cards without permission. In one case, she racked up over $50,000 in debt before she got caught." My throat went dry. "Does Terrell know?" "I don't think so. She's very good at hiding it, but that's not all." I took a deep breath, bracing myself. "The boutique she claimed she invested in," Dexter continued, each word like a blade. "It doesn't exist. No license, no address, no evidence, except that it looks like a way for her friend to receive $300,000 for free." I felt nauseous. "So the money is just gone?" "It appears so. And Glenda—" Dexter paused. "It's worse." I let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "How could it be worse?" "She's been cheating for at least 6 months. Dexter's voice hardened. "The man is wealthy and married. Raina has been using your son's money to fund the relationship. Jewelry, spa, car upgrades. It's all part of the spending trail that maintained the affair." The kitchen seemed to spin. I gripped the edge of the table to stay steady. My son, the kind, hard-working child of mine, had been turned into an ATM while his wife slept with someone else. "Does Terrell know?" I asked, my voice slipping. "I don't believe so. But there's one important detail. The man is ending the relationship. His wife found out and issued an ultimatum." I closed my eyes. And suddenly, everything connected into a straight line. "That's why Raina was desperate for money and a place to stay," I said, more to myself than to anyone. "Her funding got cut off." "Exactly." I sat there processing piece by piece. The urgent house sale, the reckless spending spree. The desperation when I refused. Raina wasn't just irresponsible, she was a predator. And my son was prey. "What do we do with this information?" I asked. "We use it," Dexter answered decisively. "In the lawsuit, we can argue the money was taken through fraud, and we can also use it to help your son understand exactly who he married." That afternoon, the process server delivered the legal papers to the motel in Oak Cliff. I knew because about 30 minutes later, Terrell called back, his voice shaking with anger, but underneath it was panic. "Mom, what the hell is this?" "That's the lawsuit, Terrell," I replied calmly. "I told you I was filing it. $67,000? You're suing us for $67,000? That's what you owe me. Plus interest, plus fees, plus damages. We don't have it." "I know," I said. "That's the price of stealing from family to fund a lifestyle you can't afford." I could hear Raina shouting in the background, still that entitled voice, like the whole world owed her. "She's asking if you've lost your mind," Terrell said, tense. "Tell your wife I'm perfectly sane," I replied, "and I'm also completely done being stolen from and assaulted. Mom, please, can't we work something out? Maybe we can—" "No, Terrell," I cut him off. "The time to work something out was 3 years ago, or 6 months ago. Or last week. That time is gone. What do you want us to do? We're in a motel." "I want you to go to work," I said, "and take responsibility for the mess you created. Raina can't work. She's never had a job. Then it's time she learns. You don't understand. She's not capable of minimum wage jobs." I stayed silent for exactly 1 beat, then asked bluntly, "What is she, Terrell? Too good to work? Too special to survive with her own hands?" The silence dragged on. Finally, Terrell's voice weakened. "She says she'll countersue for emotional distress." I almost laughed. Let her try. I have witnesses to the assault and documentation for every dollar she stole. What does she have? Then I took a breath, and I knew I was stepping into a moment with no turning back. Terrell, there's one more thing you need to know about your wife. What? I hesitated for exactly one beat. This was the moment where I either saved my son or lost him. Raina has been cheating. The silence afterward was so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. What did you say? At least 6 months. A wealthy man already married. She used your money to fund it. That's not true. It is, Terrell. I have proof. I heard Raina's voice snap in the background, sharp as a blade. What is she making up? Terrell swallowed hard. She says you're accusing her of cheating. The shouting exploded. Denials. Cursing. Threats. I didn't argue. I just handed Terrell a key. Ask her about Wesley Langford. The shouting cut off. Who is Wesley Langford? Terrell asked, his voice slowing. Ask your wife. A moment later, Terrell came back. She says she doesn't know. I didn't raise my voice. I just threw out the specific detail, what liars hate most. He's 52, owns a construction company. Drives a black Mercedes, paid for jewelry and spa for months. His wife found out last week and forced him to end it. The phone went silent for nearly a full minute. Terrell, are you still there? Terrell's voice returned, hollow. How do you know this? Because I hired someone to find out where the money went, I said. And what I found is that your wife destroyed your life to fund an affair with a man who just abandoned her. Terrell's breathing turned heavy, uneven. Mom, I need to think. Think, Terrell. I softened. One last time I had softness left. Think about how she convinced you to sell the house even though I had a legal interest. Think about how she spent $600,000 while you trusted her. Think about the slap in front of the whole neighborhood and then expecting you to protect her. Terrell's voice cracked. I'm hanging up now, Mom. And then the line went dead. I sat in my kitchen, staring at my phone like it had turned into something unfamiliar. I didn't know if I'd just saved my son or lost him, but I knew one thing. I told the truth. From this point on, what Terrell did with that truth was his choice. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was afraid Raina would come back. I'd changed the locks. I had cameras. I couldn't sleep because one question kept drilling into my mind. If Terrell knows everything, will he wake up or will he cling to a familiar lie? Simply because the truth is too humiliating. And I understood. The hardest part was still ahead. The next morning, Dexter Hargrove called me back. Glenda, I have an update. Your son just called my office. This morning, he wants to meet. I froze in the middle of the kitchen, my hands still smelling like tea. Meet about what? He didn't say specifically. Dexter replied, but his voice sounded different. Could be defeat, could be awakening, hard to say. We scheduled the meeting at Dexter's office that afternoon. I arrived early, sitting in the waiting room with a heartbeat that kept knocking like a broken clock. I thought I was ready to see Terrell, but when the door opened and my son walked in, I realized I wasn't ready for that sight. Terrell had always been thin, but this time he looked so worn down I almost didn't recognize him. His clothes hung loose on his frame, his shoulders sagged, and the dark circles under his eyes made him look 10 years older in just 1 week. He saw me first, paused for a beat as if reminding himself to stand up straight. Then he walked over and sat in the chair across from me. Hi, Mom, Terrell said quietly. Hi, I replied, my voice steady, but my chest felt like someone was squeezing it. Dexter sat behind his desk, a stack of papers already prepared. He looked at Terrell and went straight to the point. Terrell, you said you want to discuss the lawsuit. Terrell nodded. Yes, I want to know exactly what my wife has done. Over the next hour, Dexter laid out everything his investigator had uncovered, piece by piece, like lifting layers of cloth off a wound. The affair with Wesley Langford was documented through hotel receipts, credit card statements, spending records. The so-called boutique investment turned out to be nothing but a performance, a pretext to transfer money to Raina's friend. Then came the pattern of financial deception with previous men. 2 engagements, 2 endings because credit cards were used without permission. Credit card debts Terrell had never known existed. Each time Dexter revealed another detail, I watched Terrell shrink deeper into the chair, like his body was trying to make itself smaller so it would hurt less. By the time Dexter finished, Terrell wasn't looking at anyone anymore. He stared down at his hands, his shoulders trembling just slightly, and tears, soundless, quietly ran down his face. I didn't speak right away. I let the silence sit between us, like a truth no one had the strength to cover anymore. Then I asked gently, "Now, where is she?" Terrell swallowed hard. "At the motel. She doesn't know I'm here." "What are you going to do?" I asked. Terrell looked up. His eyes were red, but his gaze was empty, like someone who had just woken up from a long nightmare. "I don't know, Mom," he said truthfully. "Honestly, I don't know. My whole life, everything I thought I knew about my marriage, about my wife, it turns out it was all a lie." My throat tightened. I spoke with all the softness I still had left. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm truly sorry." Terrell shook his head like he wouldn't allow himself to accept comfort. "She's been stealing from me for years," he said, his voice hoarse. "Not just spending money. She deceived me, lied to me, made things up, hid things. And when you tried to warn me, I chose her instead of you." I looked at my son, and for the first time in many days, I saw the crack in the right place. The crack of waking up. "You were manipulated by someone who's very good at manipulating," I said, "not because you're weak, but because you believed in marriage. You believed in the person you married." Terrell flinched, like he couldn't stand hearing that. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" His voice rose. "I'm 35 years old, Mom. I should have seen the signs. I should have questioned why she never wanted to work, why she always needed more money, why she was so eager to sell the house." Dexter cleared his throat softly, steering the conversation back to what needed to be said. "Terrell," he said, calm, "the question now is what you want to do about the lawsuit. Your mother has the right to immediate repayment. Every dollar." Terrell lifted his head at once. "I know," Dexter frowned. "But you just said you don't have the money." "No," Terrell cut in, with a firmness that startled me. "My mother deserves to get it back immediately, all of it. I'll borrow, work overtime, sell whatever I need to sell." Terrell turned to me, his eyes still wet. "Mom, you've tried to protect me my whole life. And I repaid you by letting my wife steal from you and assault you." He wiped his face with the back of his hand like a child, but what he said was the voice of a man finally staring at consequences. "I'm not going to fight the lawsuit," Terrell continued. "You deserve every cent." I felt my own eyes fill. My instinct, the instinct of a mother, wanted to say, "You don't have to, sweetheart." But I had learned the lesson. Sometimes saying, "You don't have to," is the same as enabling. "Terrell," was all I managed to say. Just his name. And Terrell added, as if sentencing himself would make his chest feel lighter, "And Mom, I want you to know I'm filing for divorce today. I can't stay married to someone who lied to me about everything." A wave of relief moved through me so strongly I had to exhale, not because I'd won, but because I might have gotten my son back. "What about Raina?" I asked. "What is she gonna do?" Terrell's face hardened, like a door shutting. "Not my problem anymore. She's an adult. She made her choices. Now she has to find a way to live with the consequences." When we left Dexter's office, Terrell and I walked together out to the parking lot. Next to my car, Terrell stopped and looked at me like there was something he'd been holding in his chest for too long. "Mom," he said, "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I hurt you in a way that might not be fixable." He swallowed. "But I want you to know I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make this right." I lifted my hand and touched Terrell's cheek, the gesture I used to do when he was little, whenever he fell and tried to pretend it didn't hurt. "You're fixing it already, sweetheart," I whispered. "Right now, you already are." Driving home, I felt something in my chest that I'd thought had dried up years ago. Hope. Not just hope of getting the money back, hope that I had gotten my son back, but I also knew someone like Raina wouldn't simply disappear. A woman who had lived by manipulation and deception wouldn't accept losing in silence. And I was right to worry. There are people who, when exposed, don't feel shame. They only feel stripped of control. And when control is taken away, they do the only thing they know how to do, create a bigger spectacle. I thought that after Terrell decided to divorce, things would settle down. But the truth was, that was only when Raina began her final move. And that move, she chose to play it right at my front door, right in the middle of the neighborhood, while the sky was still dark. 3 days after Terrell filed for divorce, Raina showed up at my house at 6 a.m. She pounded on the door like she was possessed, so hard I thought the hinges might give. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. My heart jumped, not from fear, but because I saw her in a state I'd never seen before. Raina stood on my porch in yesterday's clothes. Her hair was a mess. Mascara was smeared into black streaks down her cheeks. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Glenda!" she screamed, loud enough to wake the whole neighborhood. "I know you're in there. Open the door right now." I didn't open it. I didn't step back either. The new security system was recording everything, and I had no intention of giving her a single opening. "You destroyed my marriage," Raina kept yelling. "You turned my husband against me with your lies." Across the street, Mrs. Odessa King's porch light clicked on. The Hensley's dog started barking, rapid and relentless like an alarm. I pressed the intercom button on my security system. "Raina, you need to leave my property immediately. If you don't, I will call the police." "Good," she screamed back. "Call them. Let them hear how you're destroying the life of an innocent woman." Innocent? The word sounded almost funny, if it hadn't been so bitter. "You have 30 seconds to leave," I said through the intercom. "I'm not going anywhere until you admit what you did." I called 911 and read my address clearly. "This is Glenda Carver in DeSoto. The woman who assaulted me last week is back on my property, refusing to leave and causing a disturbance." The dispatcher said officers were on the way. Raina must have heard because the pounding immediately turned more frantic. "You can't hide behind the police forever, Glenda," she screamed. "People need to know what you really are." Then she did something that shocked me, even more than last time. She started shouting the entire story of my household to the whole neighborhood like it was entertainment. "This woman turned her own son against his wife," Raina screamed. "She hired a private investigator to stalk us. She's trying to steal our money." I looked through the window. More neighbors were peeking out. Some had stepped into their yards. A few people raised their phones to record. I understood immediately. This was the stage Raina wanted. She's jealous because her son loves me more than he loves her. Raina continued, her voice piercing. She couldn't stand that he chose me, so she destroyed our marriage. The police arrived just as Raina started detailing our financial situation loudly enough for 6 blocks to hear. Officer Kiana Mercer returned, saying, this time with a male officer I hadn't met. His nameplate read, Cedric Lane. "Ma'am," Officer Mercer said firmly, "you need to calm down and step away from the door." "I'm not doing anything wrong," Raina protested. "I'm just trying to talk to my mother-in-law." "Mrs. Carver has asked you to leave her property," Officer Mercer replied. "You need to comply." Officer Lane stepped forward, his tone steady. "Ma'am, what Mrs. Carver does with her money is not your concern. This is her property, and she has the right to ask you to leave." "But she's lying about me," Raina screamed. "She's telling people I cheated." Officer Mercer opened her folder and glanced quickly. "Ma'am, are you Raina Carver, the one who was arrested here last week for assault?" "That wasn't assault," Raina argued. "It was just a little slap." "You slapped Mrs. Carver across the face in front of multiple witnesses," Officer Mercer said coldly. "That is assault." I watched from inside the house through the glass, and I saw Raina's composure collapse completely. She dropped to her knees right there on my porch, sobbing in a way so dramatic that if I hadn't known who she was, I might have believed it. She angled her face straight toward my door, as if she knew I was watching. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Please, Glenda. I have nowhere to go." "Terrell kicked me out of the motel. He's filing for divorce. I don't have any money. Please don't do this to me." For a moment, just a moment, I felt a flicker of pity. Then I remembered $600,000, Wesley Langford. The boutique that didn't exist, the slap in front of the whole neighborhood, and that flicker went out. Officer Lane bent down and helped Raina to her feet. "Ma'am, you need to find somewhere else to go. If you come back here, you will be arrested for trespassing." "Where am I supposed to go?" Raina panted, sounding like a victim of the entire world. "That's not Mrs. Carver's problem," Officer Mercer said decisively. "You've been warned." And I stood behind my own door, strangely calm, understanding that this was only the beginning of the final battle. After the police left with Raina, I called Terrell. He picked up on the first ring. "Mom, I heard everything. I'm sorry. I told her to stay away from you." "Where are you?" "Another weekly rate motel in Oak Cliff. Nothing fancy, but clean. I can hold on while I figure out the next step. I'm working overtime, saving to pay you back." "Terrell, you don't have to—" "Yes, Mom, I do." Terrell's voice hardened. "I let my wife steal from you, and I stood there while she assaulted you. I have to make it right." The way he said, "my wife," had no affection left, only the cold acknowledgement of a truth, and I knew my son had truly woken up. 2 weeks later, we went to court at the Dallas County Courthouse. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Old wooden benches, fluorescent lights that made everyone look pale and tired. I sat behind Dexter Hargrove's table, hands folded in my lap, watching Raina walk in with her attorney, Sarah Chen, a woman in her 40s, sharp suit, the look of someone who billed by the minute. Raina had clearly invested in her appearance. Fresh hair, flawless makeup, a modest navy dress that still looked expensive. She was playing the role of the wrong daughter-in-law, the victim of a toxic mother-in-law. Terrell sat beside me, anxious but determined. Over the past week, he'd worked with Dexter to voluntarily disclose the financial wrongdoing to the appropriate authorities. He might be fined. He might even risk losing his job. But in exchange, Raina no longer had a knife to his throat. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Judge Patrice Noland entered. A woman around 60, silver hair, the strict gaze of someone who had heard every sob story on earth. Sarah Chen spoke first. She painted the picture of a young woman who'd lost her way, rejected by her mother-in-law, now being crushed by the legal system to destroy her marriage. "Your Honor," Chen said, voice warm with sympathy, "my client made poor financial decisions like many young people. But Mrs. Glenda Carver's response is retaliatory, hiring investigators, pushing her son toward divorce, then trying to extract money from a woman who has no ability to pay." She made Raina sound like someone who merely overspent a little, not someone who had burned through more than $600,000 and assaulted her mother-in-law. When it was Dexter's turn, he didn't tell a story. He placed facts on the table. The $40,000 promissory note with legal force, 3 years of non-payment despite repeated requests, the sale of the house without satisfying the lien, and the assault witnessed by neighbors. "Your Honor," Dexter said, "this isn't a vengeful mother-in-law. This is a woman who was systematically deceived, treated like an easy target." Then he did something that made the entire courtroom seem to pause. He called Wesley Langford as a witness. A middle-aged man in an expensive suit stepped forward, his face dark, like he wanted to disappear from the world. Under oath, Wesley confirmed the affair. He testified that Raina told him she was separated and being abused by her husband, that her mother-in-law was trying to steal her inheritance, and that she needed money to fight legally. Wesley admitted he paid for jewelry, vacations, expensive meals, because he believed he was helping a wealthy woman in crisis. Dexter asked directly, "Did you know she was using money from the sale of her marital home to fund this relationship?" "No. If I'd known, I wouldn't have been involved." "And when did the relationship end?" "Last month. My wife found out and forced me to end it immediately." Raina went pale. Sarah Chen took notes rapidly, clearly unprepared for this. Chen tried to salvage it. The affair wasn't relevant to a financial dispute, and regardless of private life, the lawsuit was excessive. But Judge Nolan didn't budge. She looked straight at Raina. "Mrs. Raina Carver, do you deny that you signed a promissory note agreeing to repay $40,000 to Mrs. Glenda Carver?" "No, but do you deny that for 3 years you have paid not $1? Raina glanced at her lawyer. "The circumstances, I'm asking yes or no." "No. You are 32 years old. Are you telling this court you don't understand that if you borrow money, you repay it?" "It wasn't a real loan. It was family money." The judge's voice turned colder. "Do you see your signature on that paper? Were you forced to sign it?" "No." "Then it was a real loan." After that, the judge moved to the assault. Odessa King testified, along with the police report. When Chen tried to frame it as a family argument, the judge cut her off. "Assault is assault. The relationship between the parties is irrelevant." Dexter continued, "The spending pattern, jewelry, spa, the fake boutique investment. Over $600,000 gone in less than 6 months, with no corresponding assets. This isn't poor management," Dexter concluded. "This is systematic fraud." The court took a short recess. I went into the restroom and splashed cold water on my face. I thought I would be shaking, but strangely, I felt clear in a way that hurt. When we returned, Judge Nolan read her ruling. "Mrs. Raina Carver, I rarely see a case of fraud and manipulation this plain. You borrowed $40,000, signed repayment terms, then avoided your obligation for 3 years while spending over $600,000 on luxury and an extramarital affair." Raina started to cry, but the judge didn't stop. "When confronted, you assaulted the very woman you deceived." She flipped a page. "The court rules for the plaintiff. Mrs. Raina Carver must pay Mrs. Glenda Carver $67,000 within 30 days. If not, the court authorizes wage garnishment and seizure of assets." Raina cried louder. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I am referring this file to the district attorney's office for review of potential criminal fraud charges." Sarah Chen stood up fast. "Your Honor, my client has no assets to pay." The judge answered, ice cold. "Your client should have thought of that before spending $600,000 on jewelry and spa treatments. This court does not reward fraud with sympathy." Outside the courtroom, Raina was still crying in the hallway. When I passed, she looked at me with pure hatred. "This isn't over," she hissed. I stopped and looked at her one last time. "Yes, Raina," I said softly. "It is over. It ended the moment you raised your hand to me." 3 months later, I was tending my roses when Terrell called. "Mom, I have news. Raina's friend, the one behind the fake boutique, was arrested for fraud. Turns out Raina wasn't the only victim. They've been scamming investors for years." "Did you get any money back?" I asked. "Probably not." "The money's gone, but if they prove Raina knew it was a scam, she could be prosecuted." "And you?" I asked. "I'm better. I got a new job. Lower pay, but honest. I rented a small apartment. Not fancy, but it's mine." "Are you happy?" I asked. Terrell went quiet for a long beat, then said softly, "I think I am, Mom. For the first time in years, I wake up without fearing a financial disaster. I know what I have, what I owe, what I can spend. It's freeing." "And the $67,000? I asked. "I pay every month, just like I promised. It'll take a few years, but I'll repay every cent." "Terrell, you don't need—" "Yes, Mom, I do." His voice was steady. "Not just for the money, but so you can see I'm still the man you raised." I hung up and sat in the afternoon shade, realizing I'd gotten my money back, or nearly. But more than that, I'd gotten my son back. As for Raina, she was facing allegations in multiple places. Wesley Langford's wife filed for divorce and demanded half. The fake boutique case expanded into a multi-state fraud investigation. People who live by deception eventually pay for it. That night, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "I know where you live. This isn't over." I stared at the words for a long time, then blocked the number and deleted it. Raina could threaten me as much as she wanted, from whatever jail cell or courtroom she might be facing. I had cameras, I had security, I had the law, and I had one unshakable thing. I had done the right thing. A year later, I sold my house in DeSoto and moved into a retirement community in Waxahachie. Warm, peaceful, with a gardening club, a book club, and neighbors who understood the value of simple joy. I bought a small unit overlooking a meadow. Mornings in the garden, afternoons reading by the pool. Terrell visited twice a month. He never mentioned Raina. I never asked. Some chapters only truly close when we stop speaking their name, and sitting among roses under a Texas sunset, I understood. I hadn't just survived the storm, I had bloomed after it. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones we never want to fight, against the people we never want to hurt, just to protect principles we never thought we'd have to defend. But when the battle comes, there are only two choices: fight or trade your entire life away to people who treat kindness as weakness. I chose to fight, and at 64 I discovered I was stronger than I ever imagined.